Good afternoon. Thank you everyone for attending, and it's my pleasure to be here. I will discuss today a little bit about my research in Mexico and Arizona. And I am part of a binational team that undertook this research starting in 2017 and ending in 2021. And the team members are here so they're from the University of Arizona, as well as 2 universities in Mexico. This is applied research that we conducted, and basically we looked at how both rural and urban women were making use of renewable energy, both in Arizona and Mexico, and what the barriers to and benefits of this use of renewable energy were, meaning across gender, class, and age. We looked at the research gaps in the literature and found that there were several. And this is a very nascent area of research on renewable energy and women in general. We found that energy justice from a gender perspective was very scarce in the literature. Renewable energy and women's rural and urban agricultural activities was also scarce. Renewable energy for urban, low-income, and other at-risk women were also, hardly any literature, and women's autonomy and renewable energy. We took Pierce-Blakey's recommendation seriously, and that is to basically make research useful and to engage with civil organizations as well as governmental agencies. And so our research undertaken was with individuals, community associations, nonprofits, businesses, and government agencies. And our focus was on women's daily lives and livelihoods and change-making projects related to renewable energy use and energy efficiency. We used energy justice as our theoretical framework, and I've used other frames before, and sometimes combining it with energy justice. That is feminist political ecology, for example. But energy justice really allows for a holistic examination of energy systems from the production of the energy to the consumption. And it helps to identify new actors in this energy system. And we analyzed 2 dimensions of energy justice. I don't have time to go into all of the dimensions that Sobokol et al. Discuss, but 2 of the dimensions that they discussed that we used were distributive, which is the costs and benefits of this energy, and recognition. That is a recognition of the vulnerable groups associated with this energy system and with energy transitions. Now, we argue that this use of energy justice is really necessary, but that it requires attention to issues crossing scale, so the scale of the energy project, geography, urban versus rural, Mexico versus the US, as well as, really time period. So we looked at it from 2017 to 2021, and also specific social group. Now, we used various different methodologies for the first part of the study, which was binational in nature. It was comparison between Mexico, in the northwest of Mexico, in Zacatecas, and in southwest US, which is in Tucson and around Tucson, Arizona. For the follow-up study from 2020 to 2021, we followed up in the rural and urban communities in Arizona, and we used in-depth and follow-up interviews as well as focus group interviews, but with one caveat. It was right in the height of COVID, so we used Zoom, we used telephone interviews, we used WhatsApp, everything that didn't require face-to-face interviews. So we chose initially communities and neighborhoods that were within 70 miles from the cities of Tucson, Arizona, and Zacatecas, Mexico. So the city plus communities that were within 70 miles of those cities. That is Tucson, Arizona, and Zacatecas, Mexico. And that is the city of Zacatecas within the state of Zacatecas. So let me show you on a map where in the world these places are. So Tucson, Arizona is in that green circle. It's right near the border. In fact, Tucson is 1 hour from the border with Mexico, but that is Northwest Mexico. And Zacatecas is further north. So I did a lot of research actually in communities about 3 hours from Tucson, but Zacatecas is further north. So in the Tucson, Arizona location, we looked at a project that was within about 70 miles from the city of Tucson. And it was among the first in the US to be a combined solar and wind energy project. It was a large scale project, and it was 10 miles from the rural community of Cascabel. That was the closest rural community. That's why we studied that community. And it had generation of 30 megawatts of wind power and 71 megawatts of solar power in 2 stages. That's why it's called Red Horse 2. And then they expanded for more panels, and then it became Red Horse 2 and 3. They didn't expand the number of turbines, and it only created 5 full-time jobs. Then the comparison site in Mexico was near Zacatecas, the state you see, and with the city of Zacatecas indicated in Mexico. And it was a wind-only project of 130 megawatts for only the Volkswagen factories of Guanajuato and Puebla, which were 2 cities that had Volkswagen VW, that is, factories. And so this was built specifically to supply those factories so that they could claim to be sort of more green. And it created a lot of temporary jobs, fewer permanent jobs. Now, it was complicated, but some of the objections to this large scale project, both in Arizona and then in Zacatecas, were the view shed in Arizona, because this was a location which was very beautiful in a valley, right surrounded by mountains where a lot of tourists came. And a lot of the women that I talked to actually depended on that tourism economy. So they had that objection, not to the turbines or the solar panels themselves. Those were not even visible for most people. But what they had the objection to was the transformer towers. Those connected the basically electricity to the grid, and from actually New Mexico, then through Arizona to the city of Tucson. So all of the electricity basically was produced for urban populations. This community, this rural community near this, they didn't even get their power from this. They were actually only experiencing kind of the negative ramifications really of this. Also, bat and bird deaths were in both locations, and since the construction, they have put in these devices in Arizona to reduce bat deaths. Now, in Zacatecas, you'll see in some of the next photos that the turbines were much nearer to the residences. So in the peri-urban area in Zacatecas, they were a few hundred feet away from the residences, whereas in Arizona, it was a rural area, and as I said, it was about 10 miles away. So the people didn't even see these. So this is in Zacatecas, you see that in this peri-urban location that these are residences right here, and that's where the turbines are. Also in the rural areas, you saw the turbines from the rural communities. But this is kind of a nice juxtaposition where you see a sign for solar hot water heaters on the wall, and basically an advertisement. And then here on some houses, you see these solar hot water heaters. So it's the small scale project of the solar hot water heater that is benefiting the local populations, and then the wind turbines that actually are producing energy for Volkswagen in other states, not even the same state. Okay, so some of the similarities and differences, I'll just go by this quickly, but it's a sense of the differences. The land ownership and the large scale project were different in the two locations. In Zacatecas, the local rural people had to rent out their land to the owners of the wind project, and they rented out their land legally. They had to in perpetuity. They never got their land back, or that was the idea, that they would never get their land back. Okay, but in Arizona, they didn't have to. Why? Because there's a lot of federal land in the West, and the project was built solely on federal land, and one small part of it on a large landowner's land, and he got compensated nicely for it. He also got a solar pump to sweeten the deal, and he got to still be able to have his cattle on part of the land. Okay, so their, foreign technologies were the same, across the two different projects, and very little local benefits and wildlife deaths were the same. If we go now to the small scale of renewable energy projects that were existing in these very same communities, we see differences. And we see a degree of autonomy that you don't see in the large scale projects. So, for example, we looked in both cases in Arizona and Mexico at self-taught male innovators, and looked at then what they were doing and how they were sharing their knowledge, and then how that was appropriated, that knowledge, and then basically used and adapted by women in these communities. So it turned out that in both cases, mostly who were the people, taking this knowledge up were women. They were the ones to actually attend these workshops, mostly of this guy who was this famous, actually, male innovator in Tucson, Arizona. And then they brought those ideas home to their own families. What was interesting was that it wasn't only solar, it was also other sustainability measures that this guy, this solar innovator, was using. So he was doing permaculture, he was doing urban agriculture, he was doing rainwater harvesting, what he's most famous for, Brad Lancaster. Basically, and he put educational signs so that others in his neighborhood would look and learn. Okay, the same thing we found actually in Zacatecas. There were these brothers who were self-taught, again, innovators. We like to think of college as being very important, but these guys were totally self-taught. So they had a desire to really help their community. They had a pilot project in their own house where they put solar panels, solar hot water heater on their solar oven, and they had a variety of different sustainability measures that they did there. And basically people looked and noticed in their neighborhood, and they brought people from other neighborhoods to look. And so women began to look at these, and leaders, actually, we talk about the leaders in these communities actually then started to notice and started to take action on these. And these were often women leaders, but it was a personal initiative. So it was fleeting, because when they sold the house, because they couldn't afford to keep it up, then basically the project ended. They didn't receive any government funding. So in urban Tucson, then, if we go there, we see that there was a community garden as part of a public housing project that was meant to be for grandmothers raising grandkids. And both in Tucson and in Zacatecas, that is very common. Grandparents, especially grandmothers, raising grandchildren. In Arizona, it's because of the high opioid crisis and incarceration rates of parents. In Zacatecas, it's migration. So we found that commonality. And what we found was that in Tucson, there was a special housing project developed for parents. And it had solar panels, it had solar hot water heaters. So the women who were in this housing saved a lot of money on energy costs. And when they did their community gardening, they basically had solar panels that covered their area so that they didn't get too hot, which is very hot in Tucson. Now, the same thing, as I said, existed in this time in the rural community in Zacatecas. And basically, there was no such project, no nonprofit working for elderly women in rural Zacatecas. And women, instead of solar panels or solar hot water heaters, they were using, especially the poor, were using wood burning boilers or electrical water heating appliances, which are actually quite dangerous. And they can't access existing programs promoting solar hot water heaters, which do exist, because they can't travel to the city because they can't afford to. If they don't have somebody to take them, and because of this reason, because they can't install solar panels on their roofs when they're like this. They're old, and the roofs just are not able to withstand the weight of a solar hot water heater. So there are limitations. So even though there are some government programs which are reaching some people, as we saw on that roof, that solar hot water heater, and with the dogs playing below, but there are limitations because elderly women are also poor. Now in rural Cascabel, that's the closest community to the Arizona energy project. There's a community leader named, we'll call her Betsy, and she's the head of the Cascabel Conservation Association. And she has many different types of renewable energy sources that she uses, including wind for a pump and solar for her kitchen garden, for an electrified fence, for a fan. And over time, what she did, and we focused on that for the second follow-up study, is what do you do when there's climate change, when temperatures are rising, when there's lack of water for irrigation? Well, you add more panels or you add more fans. This case, she didn't need to add another solar panel, but she added another fan for her greenhouse. Okay, so over time, people innovate. So so this is the community garden in Cascabel, and they innovated by adding greenhouses so they could start their basically production earlier. And they put shade cloths on so that it would shade it from the hot sun. They did things like put 2 solar panels to power 2 fans for the new greenhouse. And, but they procured funding in this rural community, not from government sources, but again, from private sources. Now, there was a similar community leader in Mexico, and we'll name her Samantha. And she was trained by the Gallego brothers, remember they're the innovator brothers, through a nonprofit. ISAC, it's called. And they aim to have kind of gender parity, where more, where an equal number of women and men would attend the trainings of how to make their own solar hot water heater. Out of what? Just plastic water bottles, okay, and PVC pipe. Okay, so they collected water bottles and they made these. But guess who showed up? It was the women who showed up. Why? Because they were responsible for providing hot water to their families for bathing, right? And so, and Zacatecas gets cold at night and in the winter. So they need hot water. So, this was, they found basically these, workshops then challenged, gender stereotypes. Here, women were making these. It involved material reuse, right? Plastic water bottles. Children became more aware of like when the sun was shining and when it would be good to take a bath, right? And they saved a lot of money, half the cost of the propane gas that they had been using for heating water. Some people hadn't been heating it at all before that. And they saved time. But the women we found were not using that time then for personal time or recreation. But they said that their husbands were against this. But then when they found out how useful they were, they laughed. And one of them said, "My husband bathed thanks to trash." Okay, so what does all of this mean then? Energy justice then helped shed light on issues related to gender dimensions of the energy transition, including solar energy technologies and scale, grassroots innovations over time in solar energy production and use, and leadership in solar energy technology dissemination. Male innovators with no formal education were sharing their knowledge, and women were adapting it to their needs. There's demonstration housing for knowledge dissemination, and that was a method to change social practices, encourage technology adoption, and reduce energy costs across social classes, but government funding was needed. Las Abuelitas, which just means the grandmother's housing project, acknowledges local needs, but it falls short in meeting grandmothers' needs across Tucson. That is because basically that project could not restrict it to just the elderly women or men. It had to open it up to everybody within the income bracket that they were looking for. But still, it was a place that elderly women who were raising their grandkids could apply to for housing that was more reasonable, and where energy costs were a lot lower. In Zacatecas, there are no similar initiatives serving this population. In Arizona, there were more bottom-up initiatives to meet household and community needs, and organizations support scaling up of these initiatives. So now the organization Primavera Foundation that runs Las Abuelitas housing project in Arizona, they have now, because of the success of Las Abuelitas, they're putting solar panels on all of their projects, including men's shelters, women's shelters, and basically saving money in the process. And they're gaining funding from especially private donors, and to a lesser extent, finally, government programs and initiatives. And with this infrastructure plan, they're hoping to, get access to more funding for that. Because with the higher temperatures, of course, energy needs are skyrocketing, especially for air conditioning, and nonprofits are really suffering unless they do something like this. Now, female community leaders help to spread knowledge about the benefits of small-scale renewable energy projects for women, which include lower energy costs, change in gender stereotyping, increased involvement in environmental issues, and development of community leadership skills. Now, they were doing it, as I said, through their children just watching what happened, when they should take a shower, right? or it happened also because they were community leaders, like Betsy, who was a community leader and director of this Cascabel Community Association. And because of her role in that, she was the one who held the community fair every year. So everybody from the community and surrounding communities, plus people who were relatives of the people in Cascabel, came from far and wide and attended that fair and saw what she was doing in her fields and in her home with renewable energy. And then those ideas spread. For large-scale projects, those who give them their land, and these are part of recommendations, again, following Blakey, that this research should be useful and should try to inform policy and planning. So for large-scale projects, those who give their land to large-scale projects should benefit in terms of energy provision, like in Zacatecas. So currently, they do not get any of that energy, and they don't get even, subsidized energy. What people were saying in Zacatecas is, well, maybe if they add solar panels to this wind energy project, we can demand that some of that energy be given to our communities at a subsidized rate. But that still hasn't happened. They haven't installed solar panels there. Those living near large-scale projects should benefit through reduced energy costs, like in Arizona. They live near Red Horse 2 and 3, and they don't get any of the energy. It goes right to Tucson. They have another energy provider. And exchange visits between innovators, students, and community leaders would increase knowledge sharing, and some of these should be binational. We should not think of that every place is so totally unique that people from different places can't learn from each other. They can, because you can often find similarities and useful lessons learned. And you should invite also the self-made innovators and women community leaders. So other recommendations are state support is necessary for upscaling of renewable energy use related to women's daily lives and livelihoods. Demonstration and public housing is also needed. And state support is needed for those, including existing ones where you can add solar panels, for example, add solar hot water heaters, so that energy costs can come down for whoever is running and managing these projects. And state support is necessary for subsidizing solar energy technology costs, especially for the vulnerable, including elderly women. And not only do you need to subsidize these technologies, you need to bring them to where people are and realize limitations of the vulnerable to access programs. In the US, nonprofit involvement in training regarding technology development and use is needed, like in the case of the nonprofit ISAC, where they taught women how to make their own solar hot water heaters. Well, a lot of these technologies, they could train people. Now we see, for example, retraining programs even on a different scale in Appalachia, where in coal mining communities, right? So now people are being retrained in renewable energy technologies in that industry. So it could take place in the workforce, but it could also take place where women are trained how to use these renewable energy technologies to make their daily lives and livelihoods easier. In Zacatecas, greater access to renewable energy for livelihood activities is needed for women's economic empowerment. So future directions, and then I'll ask you for some questions. So I'm going to start writing an article with Caitlin Spangler and Erica Smithwick on solar energy and energy justice in rural Pennsylvania. And I'm proposal writing on solar energy, women in agriculture in Pennsylvania with Caitlin Spangler, postdoc, many of you know, possibly others. And for the Penn State University WEF Nexus Initiative and program in Latin America, I am writing a proposal on water energy food nexus in Isla Fuerte, Colombia, which is to work with women leaders who are very much leading the initiatives on solar energy production for this small island, and work with them to see how it could be greater utilized for agriculture and fishing, including processing activities, because that's the end of the spectrum that women predominate in. And we would work with the nonprofit Ocean Vida. Thank you. And to continue the conversation, you can contact me there. I also want to direct you to two of my articles in case you're interested in learning more about what I talked about today. One is Patriarchy and Electric Power, a Feminist Political Ecology of Solar Energy Use in Mexico and the United States, in the journal Energy Research and Social Science. That was with this whole team. And then Energy Justice, Renewable Energy, and the Rural-Urban Divide, Insights from the US in Energy and Climate Change, with Karina Martinez, pictured the second to the left.